let me bring up the antidote as to why I think we need to get away from this kind of what I call the despondency trap, right? To be despondent, to be dystopian, to think negatively. First, we can look at all of the things in a negative light, like here, every year 300,000 women die from pregnancy-related causes. The majority of the world lives on less than $10 a day. 10% live in extreme poverty. Almost a quarter of the world population lives in autocratic regimes, and the list goes on. I can take the same facts, and I can look at it from a time-based point of view, and say, well, let's turn this around a little bit and say the number of women who die from pregnancy-related causes has declined. It's actually gotten better. And the percentage of people living in poverty has fallen to less than 10% in a decade. And the percent of the world living in autocratic regimes has also declined, at least as of this reading, which is about 2 years ago, and so on. So I can take another viewpoint. Right? I can have a despondent viewpoint, or I can have a sort of more optimist point of view. And I think this is an important story because also, of course, quite clearly in social media, which is the prime culprit here, I think the bad things spread about 5 to 6 times faster. And this is really the very big deal about social media that we absolutely must address. And the other thing, good things take much longer. To do good things takes longer. It's much easier to do bad things, right? Or it's much better, much quicker to make a dystopian movie. Look at all science fiction, 95% is dystopia, right? Except for maybe Her. Even that is dystopia, right? So good things take longer. And so we have this tendency, as Kevin Kelly says, right, that we need to look at a different direction here. And we have this tendency of looking at the negative things much quicker. And he says we should be optimistic not because there's less problems, but because our capacity to solve them is larger than we thought. This is a key sentence. Kevin is a great idol of mine, so to speak. Everything he writes is pretty amazing stuff. Of course, he's a co-founder of Wired magazine quite some time ago. He lives in San Francisco. Let me show you a couple of facts here about what is actually better than we thought, right? Technology is getting cheaper and cheaper, enabling us to do things much quicker, like human genome data sequencing. This is the cost per megabase going towards zero, essentially. Lots of things we can do with that. The power of computing is increasing. So we can do stuff like climate control using technology. We have lots of innovation platforms generating trillions of dollars. So it's just a partial list here on the left. We have new nuclear fusion reactors coming up, and lots of money going into this, into potentially a safe version of nuclear. We have a sustainability revolution where we can seek stuff like protein and transportation already changing in a very large way. And of course, we have the climate change crisis being attacked by climate technology. And that one really allows us to think larger when we look at this curve, right? This is all happening in the next 2 to 10 years. I mean, tremendous progress, pretty much allowing us to have all the tools we need to solve this. So the bottom line is, we have all the tools, we're just going to make the right decisions. That makes me optimistic. At least we don't have a problem with not having the tools or not knowing what to do. We know what to do, we just won't do it, right? So that's another issue we're going to discuss later in the conversation. Key point here, our mistrust of the future makes it hard to give up the past and the present. This is, I think, Noah Pawnee, a poet, or a keynote speaker who said this the other day. I picked it up from him. But we have to trust the future, right? So that it's not hard to give up the past. So that it's hard to move towards optimism. Optimism is a choice. Again, I think this is very clear when we look at the future. Again, Kevin Kelly says, over the long term, the future is decided by optimists and not by pessimists and by dystopians. I mean, that is just Hollywood, right? Great book. You should read about this if you want to be an optimist. Read about why humans are actually kind. Humans are not evil. I believe that as well. Generally speaking, there are some exemptions. But Humankind by Rutger Bregman, great book to read if you want to think optimistically about the future. The other thing is that it's really easy to be dystopian, right? I mean, to think of the world ending, there's endless scenarios, right? But utopia, which is a world that is pretty and perfect, that can also be a dangerous fantasy. Think of the Nazi utopia that was propagated as part of the Nazi propaganda, that is like the perfect world that we design and control. That can also be dangerous. So Kevin talks a lot about the alternative. He calls it the Protopia. I love the whale here because it's kind of like whales don't do that, right? But it's something that we can imagine as a potential future. And lots of great quotes from him on this, right? He says, for example, that Protopia defines a state that is better than today than yesterday, but maybe just a few steps, right? It's a gradual thing. And Protopia is not, this is a great word, it's not like imaginary heaven or nirvana. It's a stepwise approach to improving things. He also says, in this article, I'll put the link up here later, he says he's hoping that we can get out of this being blind for the future and that we generate plausible visions of the future, right? And basically thrilling enough to aim towards. And I think this is a really powerful thing to think about how we can tackle the future to create something that's thrilling for us. And he says a summary basically being that it's a slow march towards incremental betterment. That's what Protopia is. I think that's a good strategy. It's not dystopia, it's not utopia, it's not utopia with an EU, that's another version of it. It's kind of like this. You know, we have the burning planet now, and Protopia would be to imagine that we can return it to the state where it was within the next 20 years. I think it's entirely possible. So this is something that I think is a good philosophical background of this. Now, the last couple of weeks, we've seen kind of the opposite happening with the climate bill, the Build Back Better by Biden being utterly defeated because of this Senator Manchin veto. Right? But surprisingly, yesterday, we had the opposite, where basically a new bill came forward from Manchin that was the biggest bill ever in the U.S., and then it passed. And so 2 weeks ago, it was nothing. Everything was falling apart. And now there's a new deal, right? And here's my good friend.
This bill
Biden.
would be the most significant legislation in history to tackle the climate crisis and improve our energy security right away. Now, give us a tool to meet the climate goals.
Keep talking. But basically, this is kind of interesting to see how this Protopia came about, right? With all the pressure that has built up. And it's not that we're hopeless there. It's just we had to reroute first, right? So, as I said earlier, we have all the tools, that's the science and the tech, and the money. We also have the money, but we must work on the telos. You know, telos is the wisdom, the understanding. This is, of course, old Greek word that is widely used by Aristotle, refers to the full potential of something. So this is why I've pledged many times that we should have a council of the wise people, you know, to bring forward the telos. And I think we really need to go back to this, and it can't just be the World Economic Forum or the UN or, you know, people within country. We need a global forum for telos, you know, for wisdom, how to change those things. Last thing I want to say about Kevin Kelly is this one, where he says a deep history of an idea makes it clear that the optimistic stance of believing something is possible is a requirement. If we want to build a good future, we have to be able to believe that it's possible. That's been my argument all along in the film. I think that's my argument as to why I feel optimistic. We are at the fork in the road moment. You know, we're at a place where it's essentially emergency time. And this is the fork. It's not just a fork, right? It's a lot of people are saying this is the decisive decade to address climate change, to look at technology regulation, to create a just world. And I'm with Antonio Gramsci, an Italian philosopher. He said that we should have pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. This is, and I sometimes say optimism of the heart, right? Also, so we should be intellectually curious and ask questions and not be naive, but we should remain optimists. And, you know, really what's happening now is we're heading to emergency 2030, not 2050. And we really need to have immediate action on some of these items. That's why we need the optimism. So the belief that tomorrow can be better than today is an essential requirement. And this is why my pledge is for us to develop that optimism and to groom it and to help each other feel optimistic. And this is, by the way, why the world's 10 happiest countries, you can see them here, led, of course, by Switzerland and Denmark and Finland. Right? There is optimism that people can feel there. So we should discuss as to why that is, but I think this is going to be really, really important for the future, because I don't want to be in a future that looks like this, you know, where we all feel like a turtle lying on our back when we can't do anything because we feel stuck. Right? I really believe our attitude contains our future. And if our attitude is pessimistic, we'll build a pessimistic future. And that's not something that we would want.